So
Great.
any questions from anybody? Okay, so
Okay.
let's go ahead. Mac, you and I will go to mute and stop video. Adam, we'll turn it over to you to kick this thing off with your interview with Tim. It's all yours, Adam.
Great. Greetings. My name is Pastor Adam Durso, and I'm the Executive Director of Lead NYC and a born and raised New Yorker. And I have the incredible privilege of sitting here and talking with my friend, pastor, teacher, author, the accolades go on and on, Pastor Tim Keller. Pastor Tim, how are you today?
I'm like you. I'm in my home.
You've lived in New York now, how long?
31 or 32 years.
So we've officially adopted you at this point, right? You're a New Yorker through and through, pretty much?
Not well, I don't want you to, please don't do the math, but I'm still not quite 50%. But I won't be long. So.
Well, you've lived through other crises in New York. 9/11, the crash in 08, 09, the Bronx is burning into the crack epidemic. I mean, so many of those things that we've lived through as New Yorkers. How do you compare those experiences to the current COVID-19 crisis that we're facing?
Of course, like and unlike. It was, it's like it in that those felt unique and nobody was quite sure what to do. And this feels unique as well. And also back in those times, there was also a lot of pressure on people to leave the city. And there's going to be a lot of pressure on people to leave the city again. So in those ways, it's alike. What's obviously different is like after 9/11, if all people who are here remember that the churches were packed.
Yeah.
That people showed up, everybody wanted to come together, and the normal way that we pastors deal with crises like this is you get people together and you speak to them, you speak God's words to them. But now we can't. Everybody's away from each other, which means that there's a lot of things that those of us who went through those other crises did that we can't do. And so in that sense, it's like the others, it's unique. And the way forward isn't completely clear. So it's like and unlike.
You know, you talk often on the topic of revival, Pastor Tim, and, you know, revival and history has been birthed out of difficult situations, crises. Do you see the church transitioning to a season of revival? I mean, both in after 9/11, when churches were packed, we also recognized that a few months later, church attendance did drop. I mean, where do you see us heading in terms of post-COVID and revival?
Yeah, I certainly hope there'll be a revival. I mean, if we dial back, the 1857 Fulton Street revival was God tends to use crises to trigger revival. I think that's the best way to put it. So there was a Wall Street panic in 1857 that led to the prayer meeting revival. 1907, the Korean revival began, Pyongyang revival, that really swept Korea. And it was the result of a war in which, again, was the aftermath of the war, not in the middle of a war or even the middle of a pandemic or in the very middle of something. Very often the revival doesn't happen, but very often afterwards. And it was because the Japanese conquered Korea, and that was a crisis, and it was a factor. And the plagues of the 1st and 2nd century in the Roman Empire, we know from history that the way Christians stayed in the city and took care of the sick, in the aftermath, again, triggered greater Christian growth. So in all those senses, I'm hoping also that there would be some way forward. I mean, crises not only trigger something specific, like there was a kind of humiliation that happened to the Koreans in the war. There was a fear that would happen with Wall Street people in the panic. And then what that'll do is that'll lead people more to say, maybe the self-sufficiency, the normal human heart self-sufficiency gets shattered. And I would just say a greater percentage of people are open to the gospel. Not everybody, not even half. But even to have say 10 or 20% of the non-Christian population being a little more open to hearing gospel presentation, that can result in revival. So I'm hoping so.
How would you identify if revival came? What are the identifiable markers of true revival if we were to see it, so that we could perceive it and know that it's come?
Well, that's if you read Richard Lovelace, who was an expert in studying awakenings, he would say revivals happen when nominal Christians, people who think they're Christians, start getting converted and telling you. Nominal Christians get converted. Sleepy Christians, people who are not, they're believers, but they're not particularly energized. They wake up and become very energized in mission. And some of the hardest non-Christian cases actually come in because they're attracted by the new beauty of the church. They're attracted by the beauty of its love for strangers, its love for others, its love for one another. And so when nominal Christians get converted, sleepy Christians wake up, and non-Christians are attracted to the church, then you've got a revival, which means you do see church growth, but it's quality and quantity. Adam, it's not just there are ways to grow anything. There's ways to grow organizations, businesses that have nothing to do with the Holy Spirit. And it's possible to grow an organization through good marketing. But when we're talking here about a growth in both quality, which means that the holiness of the lives of the people, the beauty of the community, as well as quantity.
Pastor, I look at the scriptures in Acts chapter 8, and to me, I see a direct correlation to what the church is facing right now in COVID-19. Acts 8, verse 1, on that day, a great persecution broke out against the church at Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered through Judea and Samaria. Help me exegete the text here, Pastor Tim. We've got the church, they're staying in Jerusalem, persecution, crisis hits. Help me understand it in light of the church in New York City specifically today.
Yeah, right. It was the persecution that happened after Stephen was stoned to death, and what it did was it forced Christians in a way I'm sure that they weren't happy with, but it would force them to flee because they were afraid if they stayed in Jerusalem in a big critical mass that there might be persecution, they might be killed. So they actually left in order to preserve life, which is right and good. And yet God used it. So could that happen now? Here's one thing I'll just briefly say. Most of the articles I've been reading by urban experts, how will this change city dynamics? I've been trying to read up on that. One of the things they said is neighborhoods will become more vibrant. Because what they believe that increasingly, for a lot of reasons, which I won't go into, but you can almost intuit, there'll be more people who maybe only go into the office 1 or 2 days a week and they work from home the other 3. And that's going to happen more and more. And what that means is neighborhoods that often didn't see many people there during the workday, neighborhoods would sort of get dead because people went out to work. Now, more and more people will be actually working in their neighborhoods, and neighborhoods will be more vibrant, more street life, more people in the neighborhoods. And what that would mean perhaps is that the church also needs to be decentralized, that it needs to be offloading more of its work from the big gathering on Sunday into what's happening in neighborhoods during the week, because that could be where the city is going. And Jesus always said, go into all the world and make disciples, means follow the people. So it's very possible that we are being scattered into our neighborhoods, but so is everybody else, and we may find new ways of doing neighborhood ministry, which Christians have always talked about. But I have to admit that the evangelical church tends to still see the big gathering on Sunday as the main place where ministry happens, and this might change that.
When you think about one lesson that we are learning in this season that we must ensure we carry into the next season, I find oftentimes in crisis, we learn things about ourselves, we learn things about our ministry, God speaks to us, but when we transition out of the season of crisis, sometimes we forget what God was teaching us. What's one of those lessons that as leaders we need to learn in this season and make sure we hold on to in the next season?
I'm not sure, Adam, but since you're forcing me, I wouldn't volunteer this, but you're asking me the questions. I got to say something. I would say when I talk to pastors, and during this time, you keep up with friends. Most of them say that they are taking time for reflection, for solitude, for prayer, for the kinds of spiritual disciplines that they always knew they should be taking, doing. And it's when you take away commute time, it does suddenly add the ability to do that. Because frankly, even if you go right to work at 8:30 and you're online, but in the past, it took you at least that you had to eat and you had to get there, and now when a lot of people are saying that the nurturing of the soul through spiritual disciplines, that almost everybody tells me this is the sort of thing they don't want to lose hold of when they go back to getting out of the house again. And I think that's, to me, probably the main thing we ought to hold on to.
Pastor Tim, there are so many pastor leaders are leading through this crisis, and they're hearing stories and they're absorbing people's concerns and hearing them out. I attended my first virtual funeral. I'd never experienced that on Zoom before. My wife's family had a virtual funeral, and it just felt lonely. And I think leaders are absorbing it. And I'm not sure that they know how to ensure that they're taking care of themselves. They're carrying the load of a lot of other people. I'm not sure that they're taking care of themselves in light of this COVID crisis. What would you say to a leader to ensure that they're just not depleting themselves emotionally, spiritually in this season?
Look, I love this question, Adam, because you answered it. You answered your own question. That makes it. No, I think. Let me just strengthen what you just said. After 3 days after 9/11, I got a phone call from a pastor in my denomination from Oklahoma City. As you know, the Oklahoma City bombing was in 1995. I killed 195 people or something like that, 700 maimed and all that. Oklahoma City is not a massively big city, and so it just had a devastating effect. And he said, beware of secret burnout. Because it's exactly what you're talking about. What he meant by that was, he says, actually, pastors in some ways dote on crisis. There's so many people we have to pray with and talk with, and you come back feeling very, very fulfilled, actually, because you feel like I'm doing so much good. People are hurting, and I'm here to give them words of comfort from the Lord. But he says, what you don't realize is that you're being drained. Have you noticed, for example, there's never any good news? Day after day after day, you're reading, you're watching, there's no good news. It's just bad news, there's no end in sight. And you are being drained and you don't know it, because you're working still on a certain amount of adrenaline. And he said pastors can get extremely active during a crisis for a year, and then a year or two later, they start to lose their faith. They walk away from the ministry. They walk away from their spouses. And he says, you are more tired than you think. You're more drained than you think, and you need to watch out. And so I'm actually just affirming what you just said and just trying to drive that home for all people who are listening.
Well, I'm going to make sure I take that clip about you affirming what I said, and I'm going to blast that all over the place.
That's right. Just say, Adam, you're absolutely right. And then you just take that, turn that into a meme and put it on everything you ever do.
I'm going to share it with my wife, really, so she knows. Pastor Tim, thank you so much for what you mean to New York City, what you mean to me personally, and to the leadership community in New York, to Lead NYC, to Movement Day. Thank you for who you are, your friendship, your mentorship, all your books that have mentored me for so long. And for every time that I've called or text, you always respond. You're always quick to have a lending ear or to give me counsel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adam.
Pastor, appreciate you.
Great job, Adam and Tim. Thank you guys both so much. Adam, thanks so much. And Mac, we will go live with you now. So you want to turn there we go, and your audio.
Thank you, Pastor Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Adam.
Buddy.
All right, thanks again, Adam. So we'll move on to you, Mac, and if you'll just kick things off, just as if it's a brand new thing that Adam was never here. So,
sure. Yeah. Great.
All right, I'm going to go. Let me get off and mute myself too. So give me 1 second. All right.
Great. I want to thank Tim Keller for joining us for a time to interview a little bit of Tim's reflections on city gospel movements. Tim, thanks so much for taking a few minutes to join us.
I'm glad to be with you always, Mac.
Yeah. We're interacting with leaders from around the world on this call, and I thought it'd be helpful to start as we're beginning a new decade, the year 2020, and thinking back 10 years ago. I remember standing on the roof of one of the Redeemer buildings. We did a little video on the Movement Project, and you talked about the idea of 10% of people who live in Manhattan coming to faith and attending Bible-believing churches. And I would love to have you just start by sharing the power of a big idea, the power of a goal that can capture the imagination of the leadership of a city. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, that just comes from the it's both social science, history, common experience is that a group of people does not have to be in the majority necessarily to have an influence on a culture. Recently, by the way, Mac, since we've spoken about this, I found a couple of books that said if the minority is very, very activistic, there are people out there making a case that 3.5% of the population is highly mobilized to be active, that can actually, that doesn't mean it changes everything, but change the culture. There's people who have looked at other places where if 3.5% of the population were protesting, for example, they're actually in the streets protesting, that it actually makes a change if it's that big. So if they would actually say, if there's 3,500 people in the streets every day protesting in a city of 100,000, they're going to get people are going to. What it means is the majority of people start to get sympathetic and listen, and changes happen. That's not what I think when I talk about the church growing in New York. I don't think of us being in the streets like that, but I do think that somewhere in there. Somewhere 10, 15%. I've done a lot of reading, 20% at the most. That if you have a population that is really thinking in a different way, thinking out of a Christian worldview, and using our money and conducting our family life and just conducting our relationships with other people, and working to reconcile the races, and caring about the poor, that it would have an influence on the entire city. And so I'm still absolutely sure of that. But of course, there has to be quality and quantity. But the only other thing to say is that 3.5% was assuming a highly mobilized, extremely active group of people. If we have 20% of the population going to born again churches in the city, but we actually don't look like, we're no different than anybody else. We're really not holy. And because the word holy doesn't actually mean what you think, moral, it really means different. And the biblical word for holy actually means different. If we actually aren't different, then we're not going to have an impact on the society.
It was 10 years ago when our organization in City to City, we both launched Movement Day together back in 2010. And I've been thinking about 10 years and would love your reflection on what you've seen God accelerate in the last 10 years, both in New York and around the world.
Certainly in the city, new church development and what you might call renewal. There are plenty of churches that get replanted. They still have a building, they still have the name, but they've been replanted. So there's no doubt that there's, we have statistics. City to City keeps them, and they're just the ones that we know. Every so often we get Tony Carnes, to do a survey, and we know that the number of churches are growing. Actually, I don't think I've said this anywhere publicly before. I've been part of a help by stepping out of Redeemer in Manhattan. Big churches can be a kind of bottleneck. What can actually happen is that people feel like, I got to show up there because it's such a big show. But of course, if you go to a huge church, Christians who are in a huge church are usually less mobilized. The reality is they're more passive. They come and they go. And when Redeemer broke into parts, that meant a lot of people went a lot of places and are actually better in some ways are better mobilized by starting new churches. There's quite a lot of new churches, I think, to some degree, came out of that scattering, a little bit like Acts chapter 8, when the church scattered. So it is definitely growing in New York. I would love to do another survey soon to put my finger exactly on it. But that is definitely, in spite of the secularization of society, it is growing. The church is growing in the city. One more thing, globally, what city's done now, we find the more you indigenize and contextualize the gospel and let it go, the less you hold on control. So for example, we used to bring church planters every year to New York for what we call an intensive. They were starting a church in a big city and they get trained for 3 years. We don't have an intensive in New York anymore. We've got intensives around the world in different cities and also in different languages. And therefore the number of church planters being trained by our intensive has gone through the roof, 10 times, 15 times bigger. Now you have the issue of dilution. You got to make sure that you don't lose quality when you scale like that. But no, I see church planting in every big city in the world increasing, just like in New York.
Yeah. I was interviewing Robert Guerrero a week ago, and he talked about the possibility of 1,000 churches being planted in New York over the course of a decade, all shapes and sizes of churches, just partly because of the strength of the incubator program that's taking place. We've been involved together with the whole Movement Day gathering and the commitment to the gospel ecosystem as an idea. For those that are just listening for the first time about city gospel movements, Movement Day, why in your opinion is Movement Day methodology important to a city to learn how to animate the ecosystem of their own city?
Yeah. Well, first of all, cooperation and collaboration is, Leslie Newbegin, the great missiologist, said he felt like just seeing churches work together is a witness. And just a moment.
You have to sign in. They ask you to sign in 10 minutes before it's 5 minutes.
Yes, okay. Sorry, I'm like everybody else. I'm in a room. I'm in with everyone else. It's absolutely true that when the world doesn't see churches cooperating, it's a very bad witness. And Leslie Newbegin felt like even all by itself, that actually is a witness. Secondly, the cities are too complicated, and to really be able to navigate the waters well. And every denomination, every ethnic group, every theology, every neighborhood can only see part of the whole. It's very much like what Jesus, what Paul says about the body, that we all have different gifts, and the city is so complicated and it's so complex that unless we are working together, we actually don't have the tools to understand our city. I think a third reason is just because the city is. I've always noticed that churches outside of cities who feel like they can go on their own, when you get into the city, you feel somewhat overwhelmed, and most people feel like it's all hands on deck. And I've seen Pentecostals and Presbyterians get along in cities in a way they wouldn't anywhere else. Because they feel like, well, you're Presbyterian, you're Pentecostal. In the city, there's a feeling like this is too big for any one of us to handle. And so for all those reasons, the collaboration is extraordinarily important. We should be doing it everywhere.
Right.
But in cities, it's absolutely necessary. And I do think in many ways, the intimidation factor of cities helps us.
Yeah. Last question, Tim. For people who are listening to this who have never really gotten started within their own city, what would you suggest as a first step in helping churches and agencies begin to work together within their own ecosystem?
Leaders getting together and praying, like here. I mean, I know there's a danger of taking what we saw here, Mac, in New York, and just saying, well, there's always a danger of that. But I mean, obviously what happened here was, to start with, leaders came together to pray. And the reason that works so well is because if you didn't agree on many other things, if you didn't know each other, then your theological and cultural differences would be enough that if you sat down to try to say, let's do education together, let's do even helping the poor together, let's plant a church together, we couldn't have done it. You're just too different.
Yeah.
So what can you do together that on the basis of our shared faith, we could do in spite of those differences, and we could pray? And by the way, you do remember even that, of course.
Yeah.
You know, people had to stretch for each other because we're
Right.
used to praying differently. But you could start there, and then you develop relationships, and out of the trust that came from those relationships, other things developed.
Yeah.
So I hate to say, well, you got to do it just the way we did it in New York, but honestly, after, over the years, and I think back on it, I don't see a better way to start.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you. One final question. Now, after 30 years in New York, leading in New York, what has brought you personally the greatest joy after 30 years of life and leadership in New York?
What brings me joy is the knowledge of all the seeds out there. I mean, I have certain testimonies. We all do. We have certain testimonies of people who said this ministry changed my life. This really helped me. And so we get cards and notes. We've talked to people, but I believe for every one explicit statement that this ministry changed my life, there's got to be 100 others.
Yeah,
you don't hear of. In fact, I even think, I mean, Kathy was just saying the other day that the Christian woman who ran a bookmobile for her years ago, through which she discovered books that led her to Christ. She says that woman is, I'm certainly dead by now because Kathy was 12 or something like that.
Yeah.
That woman has no idea. You know, if it wasn't for her, Kathy wouldn't have been a Christian, at least humanly speaking.
Yeah.
And she wouldn't have married me, and I wouldn't be anything like what I have been in the city without her. And so you look back, she had no idea. So for every one thing that you do know, one life you do know you touched, there's hundreds, I think, of others. And that's the thing that excites me the most.
That's great. Well, we're at the end of our time. I'm just going to offer a quick prayer and then we'll wrap up.
Thanks.
Jesus, thanks so much for a chance to visit with Tim, for his life and leadership, his legacy. Thank you for a friendship in the gospel. Thank you for Redeemer and what it means to the globe. And we pray that you would make this next decade a decade of great multiplication. And we pray that everything you put in our hearts would come to fruition and we would see it with our own eyes. In Jesus' name, amen. Yeah. Great. Thanks so much, Tim.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that interruption.
No problem.
I'm on a schedule. I've got to go into another call.
Understood.
Gospel Coalition call right now. So
it's the power of editing. So
yeah, I know.
Absolutely. Tim, thank you so much for your
thanks
time.
so much. Thanks so much.
Mac and Yuri for everything this morning.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Try to do this. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.